Story number 1. The Cursed Forest. Colorado is a land of breathtaking beauty and deadly winters. The Rockies stretch high into the sky, cloaked in snow that sparkles by day but hides treacherous dangers by night. It's a place where nature feels alive, as if the mountains themselves are watching. For years, I dismissed the rumors about certain areas being off-limits. They were just ghost stories, right? But after what happened to us in that cursed forest, I'll never look at those mountains the same way again. It started as an ordinary weekend expedition. Our group consisted of me, Jake, our fearless leader Sarah, Will, and Eric. We were all experienced outdoors enthusiasts, used to long hikes, unpredictable weather, and the occasional brush with danger. The plan was simple: a 3-day trek into a less traveled part of the Rockies. We'd set up camp in the middle of the forest, enjoy the isolation, and return to civilization with stories of untouched wilderness. The weather report warned of snow, but nothing we hadn't handled before. By the time we reached the trailhead, the sky was a dull gray, heavy with clouds that promised a storm. We laughed it off, eager to get started. The first day passed uneventfully, and by sunset, we had made good progress, setting up camp in a small clearing surrounded by towering pines. That night, the first flakes began to fall. We huddled around the fire, trading stories and jokes. The cold kept at bay by the flames and our camaraderie. But as the fire burned lower, an uneasy silence settled over us. The forest, which had been alive with the sounds of wind and creaking trees, seemed to hold its breath. Even the crackle of the fire felt muted, as if something unseen was pressing down on us. And then we heard it, faint laughter, drifting through the trees. It was soft at first, almost indistinguishable from the wind, but it grew louder, more distinct, a high-pitched giggle, like that of a child, but warped in a way that made my skin crawl. I looked around the circle, expecting someone to laugh or make a joke, but everyone else wore the same expression of unease. "Did you hear that?" Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. We all nodded, too unnerved to speak. Jake, always the skeptic, tried to brush it off. "Probably just the wind," he said, though his eyes betrayed his doubt. "Let's get some sleep. Big day tomorrow." Reluctantly, we retreated to our tents, the laughter fading but never fully disappearing. It seemed to follow us, faint but persistent, as if circling the camp. I lay awake for hours, clutching my sleeping bag tightly, listening to the eerie giggles that seemed to grow closer with each passing minute. Sometime after midnight, I must have fallen asleep, because I woke to the sound of Sarah screaming. I scrambled out of my tent, the cold biting at my face as I rushed toward the source of the noise. She was standing by the edge of the clearing, her flashlight trembling in her hand. "Eric's gone," she said, her voice shaking. "He's not in his tent." We searched frantically, calling his name, our voices swallowed by the dense forest. The snow was falling harder now, thick flakes obscuring our flashlights. We found his footprints leading away from the camp, but they ended abruptly at the base of a large tree, as if he'd simply vanished into thin air. "Maybe he got turned around," Will said, though his voice lacked conviction. "We'll find him at first light." But none of us slept that night. The laughter returned, louder and more menacing, accompanied by a sense of being watched. Shadows flickered at the edge of the clearing, just beyond the reach of our flashlights. Jake stood by the fire with his axe, his face pale and tense, while the rest of us huddled together, too scared to move. At dawn, we ventured into the forest, following the faint trail left by Eric's footprints. The storm had covered most of it, but we pressed on, driven by a mix of fear and desperation. The forest grew denser, the trees twisting in unnatural shapes, their branches forming a canopy that blocked out the light. The laughter was gone, replaced by an oppressive silence that made every crunch of snow underfoot feel deafening. And then we found him. Eric was lying in the snow, his body stiff and frozen, his eyes wide with terror. He was staring at something deeper in the forest that we couldn't see. His face was contorted in a grimace of fear, his hands clutching at his chest as if he'd tried to protect himself from whatever he'd seen. We didn't linger. Jake grabbed Eric's body, and we made our way back to camp as quickly as we could. The forest felt alive, its shadows shifting and closing in around us. The wind carried faint whispers, too quiet to make out, but unmistakably there. By the time we reached the clearing, the storm was in full force, and we knew we couldn't stay another night. The trek back to the trailhead was a blur of panic and exhaustion. The laughter followed us, growing fainter as we neared civilization but never fully disappearing. When we finally emerged from the forest, a search and rescue team was waiting for us, alerted by our missed check-in. They took Eric's body and asked us what had happened, but none of us could give them an answer. Days later, the autopsy report came back. Eric had died of hypothermia, but there was something else, scratches on his arms and neck, deep and jagged, as if made by human nails. The authorities dismissed it as self-inflicted, the result of panic and delirium. But we knew better. We never spoke of that trip again. But the memories linger. Sometimes, late at night, I hear faint giggles in the wind, and I'm transported back to that cursed forest. I think of Eric's frozen face, his eyes filled with terror, and I wonder what he saw in those woods. And I pray I never find out. Story number 2. The Whispers of the Wind. Vermont winters are unforgiving. The snow falls relentlessly, piling up against houses and roads, and the wind carries with it a mournful wail that seems to seep into your bones. My wife, Emily, and I thought we were prepared for the worst that season could throw at us. We had a sturdy cabin nestled in the woods, a fully stocked pantry, and a roaring fireplace, but nothing could prepare us for the storm that came one fateful night, or for what came with it. The blizzard hit in the late afternoon, a wall of white swallowing the world outside our windows. By nightfall, the wind was howling like a pack of wolves, and the snow had piled so high against the cabin that we could no longer see the ground floor. Emily and I huddled in the living room, sipping hot cocoa and listening to the fire crackle. The storm raged outside, but inside, we were safe, or so we thought. It started as a faint sound, barely audible over the wind, a soft, rhythmic whisper, rising and falling like the ebb and flow of a tide. At first, I dismissed it as the wind playing tricks on my ears, but then Emily stiffened beside me, her mug frozen halfway to her lips. "Did you hear that?" she asked, her voice trembling. I nodded, straining to catch the sound again. The whispers returned, clearer this time. It was a voice, a woman's voice, carried on the wind. Her words were indistinct, but the tone was unmistakable, desperate, pleading. "Help me," the wind seemed to say. "Please, don't let me die." Emily clutched my arm, her eyes wide with fear. Who could be out there in this storm? I grabbed my flashlight and moved to the window, pressing my face against the cold glass. The snow was falling so heavily that I could barely see a few feet beyond the porch. The voice came again, louder now, more insistent. "Help me." Against my better judgment, I opened the front door, the wind nearly ripping it from my hands. Snow swirled into the cabin, stinging my face as I stepped onto the porch. "Hello," I called out, my voice barely carrying over the storm. "Is someone out there?" There was no response, just the relentless howling of the wind. I shone the flashlight across the snow, but the beam revealed nothing but an unbroken expanse of white. Emily stood behind me, shivering in her thick sweater. "We need to help her," she said. "What if someone's trapped out there?" I hesitated. Everything about this felt wrong, but Emily's concern was genuine, and I couldn't argue with her logic. If someone was out there, they wouldn't survive long in these conditions. I stepped off the porch, my boots sinking into the deep snow, and began scanning the area. That's when I saw it. Written in the snow, just a few feet from the porch, were words. The letters were uneven, as if scrawled hastily by a trembling hand, and they sent a chill down my spine. "Don't let me die here." I stared at the message, my breath visible in the freezing air. "Emily," I said, my voice tight, "come look at this." She stepped beside me, her eyes widening as she read the words. "Oh my God," she whispered. "Do you think?" Before she could finish, the whispering returned, louder than ever, surrounded us, seeming to come from every direction. "Help me, please." The desperation in the voice was palpable, and it made my skin crawl. I turned back toward the cabin, pulling Emily with me. "We need to go inside." "But," she began, glancing back at the words in the snow. "Inside. Now," I said, more firmly this time. We shut the door against the storm, bolting it and piling a chair in front of it for good measure. Emily paced the living room, wringing her hands. "We can't just ignore it," she said. "What if someone's really out there?" "Emily, think," I said. "Those words, how could they have been written in the snow? There's no way anyone could stand out there long enough to do that in this storm." She stopped pacing, her face pale. "You think it's not human?" I didn't answer. The truth was, I didn't know what to think. All I knew was that the voice was wrong, unnatural in a way I couldn't explain. The whispers didn't stop. They grew louder, more frantic, and now there were footsteps, soft but deliberate, pacing back and forth on the porch. Every now and then, the doorknob rattled, as if someone were testing it. Emily and I sat by the fire, clutching each other, too terrified to move. At some point, exhaustion overtook us. I don't know when I fell asleep, but when I woke, the first light of dawn was filtering through the frosted windows. The storm had passed, leaving the world outside eerily still. Emily and I ventured onto the porch together, squinting against the brightness of the snow. The words from the night before were gone, but new tracks had appeared, footprints, leading from the woods to our front door. They were deep and wide, and they didn't resemble any human or animal I'd ever seen. There were no tracks leading away. We packed up and left that day, abandoning the cabin and heading back to town. I told the locals what we'd experienced, hoping for some rational explanation, but their faces darkened at the mention of the whispers. "You're lucky you didn't open that door," one old man said, his voice low. "The storm spirits, they're always looking for a way in. I don't know if I believe in spirits, but I know what I heard, what I saw, and every winter, when the snow falls thick and the wind begins to whisper, I think of that voice, pleading, desperate, and the words scrawled in the snow. Don't let me die here. And I wonder if whoever or whatever was out there is still waiting for someone foolish enough to open the door. Story number 3. The Vanished Car. Alaska's winters are brutal. Snow comes down in thick, blinding sheets, and the wind howls like it carries secrets from a time before men. Roads disappear under drifts, and the wilderness stretches out in a white expanse that swallows sound, light, and sometimes people. It's the kind of place that demands respect. A place where nature doesn't just kill, it erases. I learned this the hard way, during what was supposed to be an unforgettable trip with friends to see the Northern Lights. There were 5 of us, me, my best friend Luke, his girlfriend Jenna, her brother Matt, and Emily, a childhood friend who joined last minute. We were all in our 20s, full of that invincible energy that makes you believe nothing bad will happen to you. We rented a sturdy SUV, loaded it with supplies, and set out from Anchorage toward Denali. The first day of the trip was breathtaking. The sky was clear, the snow sparkling like diamonds under the pale sun. We stopped often to take pictures, laugh, and marvel at the vastness of the landscape. By the time we reached the small motel where we'd planned to spend the night, the first flakes were beginning to fall. The receptionist warned us about an incoming storm, advising us to wait it out. But we were young and impatient, and the forecast didn't seem that bad. "It'll be fine," Luke said, brushing off the concern. We've got a four-wheel drive, and we're prepared. We set out the next morning. The storm already picking up. The snow fell heavier, and the wind rattled the SUV as we navigated the narrow, winding roads through the wilderness. By noon, the storm was a full-blown blizzard. Visibility was nearly zero, and the GPS signal flickered in and out. Jenna grew more anxious with each passing mile, her voice rising in pitch as she suggested we turn back. That's when the engine started sputtering. "Shit," Luke muttered, pulling over to the side of the road. The SUV groaned as it rolled to a stop, the wind buffeting against its sides like an impatient predator. We sat in tense silence as Luke fiddled with the ignition, but the engine refused to turn over. The storm was so loud we had to shout to hear each other. "We're not going anywhere," Luke said finally. "We need to call for help." The cell signal was weak, but after some fumbling, Jenna managed to reach emergency services. She gave them our approximate location before the call dropped. "They said they'd send someone," she said, her voice shaking. We settled in to wait, the storm raging outside. Hours passed. The temperature inside the SUV began to drop, and our breath fogged the windows. Matt suggested we run the engine for heat, but Luke reminded him the engine was dead. We huddled under blankets, the cold seeping into our bones. That's when we noticed the first strange thing. The snow around the SUV, which had been piling up steadily, seemed to stop accumulating. Instead, it began to level out, as if something unseen was smoothing it over. Luke and I exchanged uneasy glances but didn't say anything, not wanting to alarm the others. The wind seemed to change, carrying with it a low, almost imperceptible hum that vibrated through the air. Then we heard it, a faint knock on the back window. "Did you hear that?" Jenna whispered, her voice barely audible. Luke and I nodded. Slowly, he turned on the flashlight and pointed it toward the rear window. The beam of light cut through the frosted glass, revealing nothing, just the snow and darkness. But the knock came again, louder this time, followed by a faint scraping sound, like fingernails on metal. "We're all hearing this, right?" Emily said, her voice tight. Luke grabbed the flashlight and opened the door, stepping into the storm. "Stay here," he said. "Are you insane?" Jenna yelled after him, but he was already outside. I followed, unwilling to let him face whatever was out there alone. The wind was deafening, and the snow swirled around us in chaotic patterns. The flashlight barely penetrated the storm, but we could see faint impressions in the snow, footprints leading away from the car. They were strange, elongated, as if whoever made them was dragging their feet. And they didn't start at the car. They seemed to appear out of nowhere, heading off into the blizzard. "What the hell?" Luke muttered. We followed the tracks for a few feet before they abruptly stopped, vanishing as if the person had been plucked out of existence. The hum grew louder, vibrating through the air, making my teeth ache. Suddenly, Luke grabbed my arm and pointed. Through the snow, a faint light flickered in the distance, like a lantern swaying in the wind. "We need to go back," I said, the words almost drowned by the storm. Luke hesitated, but the light vanished, leaving us in darkness. We turned and trudged back to the SUV, our faces numb from the cold. When we climbed inside, the others looked at us with wide, terrified eyes. "It's gone," Jenna said, her voice shaking. "What's gone?" Luke asked. "The road," she replied. "It's like it never existed." We looked out the windows. She was right. The road we'd been driving on, the road we'd parked on, was gone. Just endless snow stretching out in every direction. Panic set in. We argued about what to do, but before we could decide, the hum grew louder, drowning out our voices. The SUV began to shake, the windows frosting over completely. A blinding light filled the cabin, and I felt a pressure, like something was pressing down on us from above. Then, suddenly, everything went silent. When I opened my eyes, we were standing in the snow. The SUV was gone. The storm had stopped, leaving behind an eerie stillness. The others were as bewildered as I was, staring at the spot where the SUV had been. There were no tracks, no sign that it had ever been there. The rescue team found us hours later, huddled together, numb and silent. They searched the area but found nothing. No SUV, no tracks, just a patch of snow that looked unnaturally smooth, as if someone or something had wiped it clean. To this day, I can't explain what happened. The SUV was never found, and none of us speak about that night. But sometimes, when I close my eyes, I hear the hum again, low and insistent, as if whatever took the car is still out there, waiting. Story number 4. The House in the Blizzard. Montana winters are as cruel as they are beautiful. The snow falls heavy, smothering the landscape under a white blanket that can be both breathtaking and suffocating. It was during one such winter, a season of relentless storms and biting cold, that my family and I found ourselves caught in a nightmare that still haunts me. It was supposed to be a simple trip. My wife, Claire, and our 2 kids, Maddie, 7, and Sam, 10, were heading to visit Claire's parents for Christmas. The forecast had warned of snow, but nothing out of the ordinary for Montana in December. We packed the SUV with gifts and provisions, confident that we could make the drive before the storm hit. But the storm came faster than anyone expected. The snow began falling in thick, blinding sheets as we wound our way through the mountain roads. The windshield wipers struggled to keep up, and the road beneath us disappeared under a layer of ice and powder. Visibility was nearly zero, and the howling wind seemed to push against us at every turn. It wasn't long before I realized we were in trouble. The GPS lost signal, and the road signs, covered in frost, were unreadable. We were completely lost. When the engine began to sputter, a cold dread settled in my chest. The fuel gauge hovered just above empty, and the temperature outside was plummeting. I pulled to the side of the road, though road felt like a generous term at that point. It was little more than a snowy expanse stretching into nothingness. We sat in silence, the cold seeping into the car despite the heater. The kids huddled under blankets in the back seat, their faces pale with fear. Claire tried to stay calm, but I could see the panic in her eyes. Then, through the swirling snow, I saw it, a faint outline of a structure, just off the road. A house. "We'll head there," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "It's better than staying out here." Claire nodded, and we gathered what we could carry. The wind bit at our faces as we trudged through the snow, the house growing larger with every step. It was old, a 2-story structure with peeling paint and sagging walls, its windows dark and unwelcoming. But it was shelter, and in that moment, it was all we needed. The door was unlocked, creaking open with a groan that echoed through the empty house. Inside, it was as cold as the outside, but at least we were out of the wind. The furniture was sparse and covered in a layer of dust, the air thick with the smell of decay and mildew. It was clear no one had lived there for years. We set up camp in the living room, huddling together for warmth. I found some old wood in a pile near the fireplace and managed to get a fire going, its flickering light casting long shadows across the room. The kids fell asleep quickly, their exhaustion outweighing their fear. Claire and I sat close to the fire, listening to the wind howling outside. That's when we heard it, the first sound, a faint creak, coming from above us. It was slow, deliberate, like the sound of footsteps crossing the floorboards of the upstairs rooms. I looked at Claire, her face pale in the firelight. "It's probably the house settling," I said, though I didn't believe it. The creaking continued, moving across the ceiling and then stopping abruptly. The wind outside picked up, and with it came another sound, a soft, rhythmic knocking. It was coming from the front door. Claire and I froze, listening as the knocks came again, louder this time. I stood, grabbing the flashlight and the tire iron I'd brought from the car. Slowly, I approached the door, my breath visible in the cold air. I opened the door, the wind tearing it from my grip. But there was no one there. just the snow and the darkness, stretching endlessly in every direction. I shut the door quickly and bolted it, my heart pounding in my chest. The knocking resumed almost immediately, this time at the back door, then on the windows. It was as if something or someone was circling the house, testing every entrance. The sounds continued through the night. Footsteps on the roof, knocking on the walls, faint whispers carried by the wind. Too quiet to make out but loud enough to keep us on edge. We barely slept, our nerves frayed by the relentless noises. When dawn finally broke, the storm had eased, and the first weak rays of sunlight filtered through the frost-covered windows. It was then that Maddie pointed to the front window. "Daddy," she said, her voice trembling. "Look," scrawled across the inside of the glass, in what appeared to be frost or ice, were the words, "Leave before the snow melts." My blood ran cold. The writing wasn't there when we arrived. Claire grabbed the kids, her face a mask of fear. "We need to go," she said, and I didn't argue. We packed up quickly, ignoring the creaks and groans of the house as we prepared to leave. The snow had eased enough to make the road visible again, and with some effort, we managed to get the SUV started. As we pulled away, I glanced back at the house. Through the upstairs window, I thought I saw a figure, a shadow watching us leave. We didn't stop driving until we reached the nearest town. At a diner, I asked the locals about the house. Their faces darkened at the mention of it. "You mean the old McAllister place?" one man said. "No one's lived there in decades. Not since the blizzard of '56. Whole family froze to death inside. Folks around here say it's cursed." I didn't sleep that night, or the night after. Even now, months later, I can still hear the footsteps on the roof, the knocking at the doors, and every time it snows, I think of the words written on the window, the warning that came too late for the McAllisters and almost came too late for us. Story number 5. The Shadow in the Blizzard. Wyoming's highways are unforgiving in the winter. Endless stretches of road cut through vast, barren plains where snow piles high, and the wind howls like a living thing. As a long-haul trucker, I've braved my share of blizzards, but nothing compares to the storm I encountered on that lonely stretch of Route 287. A night I'll never forget. The forecast had warned of heavy snow, but I was confident I could beat the worst of it. My rig was loaded with supplies bound for Denver, and I had a tight schedule to keep. The first flakes began falling just as the sun dipped below the horizon, transforming the landscape into a swirling sea of white. By the time darkness fully descended, the snow was coming down so hard I could barely see 10 feet ahead. The road disappeared beneath the drifts, and my headlights illuminated nothing but a wall of white. I gripped the wheel tightly, my knuckles aching as I tried to keep the truck steady against the fierce gusts of wind. The CB radio crackled with occasional chatter. Other drivers exchanging updates on the worsening conditions. Most had pulled off at truck stops or rest areas to wait out the storm, but I was too far from anywhere safe. My only option was to keep moving, hoping to find a place to stop before the blizzard became impassable. That's when I saw him. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the snow, an odd shadow cast by my headlights. But as I drew closer, the figure became clearer. A man standing on the shoulder of the road, completely still despite the raging storm. He was dressed in dark clothing, his face obscured by the snow, and he didn't move as I approached. My initial thought was that his car must have broken down and he needed help. Out here, stranded in these conditions, person wouldn't last long. I slowed the truck and pulled onto the shoulder, my tires crunching through the snow. The figure didn't react to my arrival, remaining motionless as the wind whipped around him. I turned on my hazard lights and grabbed my flashlight, bracing myself against the cold as I stepped out of the cab. The wind hit me like a wall, cutting through my jacket and stinging my face. I squinted into the storm, shining the light toward where the man had been standing. He was gone. I swept the beam of the flashlight across the road, my breath fogging in the icy air. There was no sign of him, no movement, no sound, just the blinding snow and the howling wind. I called out, my voice barely audible above the storm. Hey, are you okay? Do you need help? No answer. I stepped closer to where I'd seen him, my boots sinking into the deep snow. The spot was undisturbed, as if no one had been there at all. But as I turned back toward the truck, I froze. There, leading from the shoulder straight toward my vehicle, was a single set of footprints. They were fresh, crisp, and unmistakable, standing out starkly against the otherwise pristine snow. A chill ran down my spine, colder than the wind. The footprints stopped at the driver's side door of my truck. There were no prints leading away. I climbed back into the cab, slamming the door shut and locking it behind me. My breath came in quick, shallow gasps as I tried to make sense of what I'd just seen. The truck was empty. No one had gotten inside. I checked the mirrors, scanned the road, but there was nothing out there. Just the storm and the eerie silence that seemed to press against the windows. I told myself it was my imagination, a trick of the snow and the shadows. But as I put the truck in gear and started moving again, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The cab felt colder than it should have, the air heavy with a strange, oppressive stillness. Every now and then, I thought I caught movement in the corner of my eye, a flicker of shadow that vanished the moment I turned my head. The radio crackled to life, static mingling with faint, distorted voices. I reached for the dial, trying to tune it, but the voices only grew louder, an unintelligible chorus of whispers that sent a shiver down my spine. I turned the radio off, but the whispers didn't stop. They seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, filling the cab with their haunting presence. My hands tightened on the wheel, my heart pounding as the road stretched endlessly before me. The storm showed no signs of letting up, the snow falling harder and faster, and the wind battering the truck like a living thing. I glanced in the rearview mirror, and my blood ran cold. There, in the back of the cab, was a shadow. It was faint, barely more than a silhouette, but it was there, unmoving, watching. I spun around, but the seat was empty. When I looked back at the mirror, the shadow was gone. I drove through the night, the storm relentless, the whispers fading in and out like a broken signal. By the time I reached a truck stop on the outskirts of a small town, dawn was breaking, the first light of day cutting through the snow. I parked the rig and stumbled out, my legs weak and my breath coming in ragged gasps. Inside, the warmth of the diner was a welcome relief, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. An older driver sitting at the counter noticed my disheveled state. "You all right, buddy?" he asked, his voice gruff but concerned. I hesitated, then told him what had happened. His expression grew serious as he listened, and when I finished, he nodded slowly. "You're not the first," he said. "There's a story about that stretch of road. Back in the 80s, a truck jackknifed during a storm, killing the driver. Ever since, people have been seeing things, shadows, figures in the snow. They say the guy's still out there, looking for help, or maybe just trying to hitch a ride." I didn't know what to say. The idea of a ghost haunting the road seemed ridiculous, but I couldn't deny what I'd experienced. Even now, months later, I can still see that shadow in the mirror, hear the faint whispers that filled the cab. I've avoided Route 287 ever since, but on cold winter nights, when the wind howls and the snow falls thick, I sometimes think I hear it again, the sound of footsteps crunching through the snow, and the faint, haunting presence of a shadow that refuses to fade.